The cruelest jokes in the galaxy were always wrapped in silver. Caleb Mercer heard the cargo clamps groan before he saw the ship through the storm. Outside his cabin window, methane snow spun across the mining ridge in pale blue spirals, scraping against the reinforced glass like handfuls of sand. The night sky above Kepri Outpost glowed with the dim shimmer of refinery towers and distant freighters drifting through low orbit. Nothing good ever arrived after midnight on a colony this far from Earth, especially not an Illyrian diplomatic vessel. Caleb pulled on his work jacket and stepped outside into the cold. The wind immediately bit through the fabric, sharp enough to sting his lungs. His boots crunched across frozen dust as the silver ship settled onto the landing platform behind his maintenance shed. Smooth, elegant, too clean for a place like this. Steam hissed from its undercarriage while blue navigation lights blinked across its curved hull like silent eyes. Then the cargo ramp lowered. 2 Illyrians descended without looking at him. Tall, thin. Their iridescent robes shimmered beneath the snow while metallic markings pulsed faintly beneath their pale skin. Nobility. Caleb recognized the look immediately. The kind of people who never carried their own weight because entire worlds carried it for them. One of them slid a data tablet into his hand. Transfer complete, the alien said flatly. Genetic asset designation Elvale has been reassigned to human custody. Caleb frowned. I didn't order anything. Correct, the second one replied. It was a gesture. The way he said gesture made Caleb's stomach tighten. Before he could ask another question, the aliens turned and walked back toward their ship without another word. No explanation. No negotiation. Just silence. The ramp began to close behind them. Hold on. Caleb called out over the wind. What exactly did you dump on my doorstep? One of the Illyrians paused just long enough to glance over his shoulder. There was something almost amused in his glowing silver eyes. A disappointment. Then the ship lifted off into the storm. Caleb stood there for several seconds listening to the engines fade into the night. The cargo container remained on the landing pad alone beneath the snow. 7 feet long. Matte black. No military markings. No temperature indicators. Only one symbol burned faintly into the side in alien script. He didn't recognize the language, but the translation appeared automatically on his wrist display. Infertile. Caleb stared at the word while the wind howled across the ridge. Then he moved toward the crate and keyed the manual release. Hydraulic locks hissed open. Warm air escaped first. Not machine heat. Body heat. The interior lights flickered on slowly, revealing a figure curled against the back wall with silver restraints around both wrists. A girl. Alien. Her skin glowed faint cyan beneath strands of dark blue hair. Soft light pulsing under the surface of her arms like distant starlight trapped beneath water. She looked smaller than he expected. Fragile almost. Barefoot. Thin. A faint bruise-colored mark circled her throat beneath a metallic collar. She didn't raise her head when the crate opened. Didn't fight. Didn't even look surprised. Caleb crouched slightly, careful with his voice. You got a name? For a moment, only the storm answered. Then finally, quietly, she spoke. Lyra. Her accent rolled gently through the cold air, smooth and musical despite the exhaustion underneath it. Caleb noticed her hands trembling against the restraints. Not from fear. From cold. You hurt? He asked. She gave the smallest shrug. You can sell me if you want. The sentence hit harder than he expected. Not angry. Not sarcastic. Just practiced. Like she had already accepted the answer long before arriving here. Caleb looked down at the restraint locks around her wrists. Then at the words still glowing on the side of the crate. Infertile. A joke. Someone across the stars had packaged a living person into a shipping container because they thought her existence was funny. The wind screamed louder across the landing pad while frost gathered along the crate door. Caleb reached forward slowly. Lyra flinched on instinct. But instead of grabbing her arm, he pressed his thumb against the restraint release. The cuffs unlocked with a soft metallic click. Yeah. Caleb muttered quietly. We're not doing that. The first thing Lyra noticed inside the house was the smell. Not chemicals. Not sterilized air. Not the metallic sharpness of ship interiors or laboratory halls. Coffee. Warm, dark, earthy coffee drifting through recycled heat vents while snow rattled softly against the outer walls. She stood frozen just inside the doorway, pale blue light flickering faintly beneath her skin as Caleb sealed the cabin hatch behind them. The heating system hummed overhead, old but reliable, filling the small home with dry warmth that slowly pushed the cold from her hands. She did not move farther inside. Caleb noticed immediately. "You can sit down," he said, setting his gloves on a nearby counter. "Nobody is going to yell at you." Lyra looked at him carefully for the first time since arriving. Human eyes were strange up close. Softer than Illyrian eyes. Less reflective. Easier to read. That almost made them more dangerous. She glanced around the cabin instead. The place was small. Maybe 700 square feet total. Steel walls. Exposed pipes. A faded brown couch near a flickering furnace vent. Tools scattered across a workbench beside stacks of oxygen filter components waiting for repair. But there were also small things she did not understand. A framed photograph beside the kitchen sink. A knitted blanket folded neatly over a chair. Yellow lights instead of white clinical ones. The space felt lived in. Warm in a way her people never valued. "You live alone?" she asked quietly. Caleb nodded once while filling a dented coffee pot with water. "Most miners do out here." "Why?" "Cheaper." He paused before adding. "And quieter." The coffee machine sputtered alive with a low growl. Lyra flinched slightly at the sound. Caleb noticed that too, but pretended not to. He had already figured out she reacted to sudden noise like someone used to punishment. That realization sat heavy in his chest. He opened a cabinet and pulled down another mug. "You drink coffee?" Lyra blinked slowly. "I do not know what coffee tastes like." Caleb stared at her for a second. "Seriously? Illyrian nutrition is regulated by genetic optimization standards." "That sounds miserable." For the first time, something almost invisible moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. More like surprise that someone would speak about her civilization that way without fear. Caleb handed her the mug carefully once the coffee finished brewing. Steam curled upward between them. Lyra hesitated before wrapping both hands around it. The warmth immediately spread through her trembling fingers. Her glowing skin softened to a calmer shade of blue. Caleb leaned against the counter, watching her take a cautious sip. A strange expression crossed her face. Confusion first, then curiosity, then something quieter. "It is bitter," she murmured. "Yeah, but warm. That is usually the point." She took another sip anyway. Outside, the methane storm deepened, wind groaning against the reinforced walls while snow buried the landing platform inch by inch. Inside the cabin, the furnace clicked softly and old pipes rattled with heat. Lyra looked toward the framed photograph near the sink again. A woman stood beside Caleb in the picture, both smiling beneath sunlight outside somewhere green and alive. Caleb noticed her staring. He reached over and gently turned the framed face down without saying anything. Lyra lowered her eyes immediately. "I am sorry," she whispered. "You did not do anything wrong." Silence settled between them for a while after that. Not hostile silence, just tired silence. The kind shared by two people carrying things too heavy to explain in one night. Finally, Lyra looked down at the metallic collar still locked around her throat. "You forgot one restraint," she said softly. Caleb followed her gaze. His jaw tightened slightly. "No," he replied. "I noticed it." He stepped closer, careful not to move too fast. Lyra stayed perfectly still while he examined the device beneath the kitchen light. Alien lettering pulsed across its surface. Property seal. Genetic designation. Transfer authorization. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he reached into a nearby toolbox and grabbed a small cutting instrument. Lyra looked up at him, confused. "What are you doing?" Caleb adjusted the tool in his hand. The blue plasma edge reflected softly in his eyes, making sure nobody ever puts another leash on you again. By morning, the storm had buried half the landing platform beneath 3 feet of blue-white methane snow. Caleb woke before sunrise to the sound of metal creaking softly under shifting ice outside the cabin walls. For a few seconds, he forgot someone else was in the house. Then he smelled fresh coffee already brewing from the kitchen. He sat upright immediately. The old couch groaned beneath him while dim amber light flickered through the hallway. Caleb grabbed his jacket and stepped carefully into the kitchen, expecting trouble. Instead, he found Lyra standing near the counter staring at the coffee machine like it was some sacred artifact. Steam drifted around her glowing skin while pale morning light spilled through the frosted windows behind her. She had wrapped herself in one of his gray thermal blankets, the oversized fabric hanging awkwardly from her slender frame. The collar was gone now. The faint red mark around her throat remained. Caleb noticed she had already cleaned the mug she used the night before. "You know how to work that thing?" he asked. Lyra looked slightly embarrassed. "I observed your actions. That is either impressive or terrifying." A faint shimmer crossed her expression again. Not quite a smile, but closer than before. Caleb poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter. Outside, refinery sirens echoed faintly across the valley while transport haulers crawled through the storm like glowing insects. Another normal day on the edge of nowhere. Then his wall monitor chimed. Incoming transmission request. Public channel. Caleb frowned. Nobody called this early unless something exploded. He tapped the screen open. A live stream flooded the monitor instantly. Bright silver banners. Elegant Illyrian architecture. Hundreds of comments racing across the bottom of the feed in alien script. At the center of the broadcast stood the same nobleman from the night before, smiling calmly toward the camera. "As many of you requested," the Illyrian announced smoothly, "we are pleased to provide updates regarding subject Lyra Vale and her cultural reassignment." Experiment. Caleb's stomach tightened. Lyra froze beside the counter. The comments scrolled faster now, automatic translation flickering beneath them. Defective female. Worthless bloodline. Human pity project. Genetic failure exchange. Some comments included laughing symbols Caleb did not recognize, but understood immediately anyway. The nobleman continued speaking with polished amusement. "Our viewers have shown remarkable curiosity regarding whether humans possess lower enough standards to bond with biologically compromised females." More laughter symbols flooded the feed. Current estimates suggest the human subject will attempt emotional attachment behavior within 72 hours. Caleb stared at the screen in disbelief. "They are broadcasting this." Lyra lowered her eyes without answering. Her glow dimmed visibly beneath her skin. "You knew about this?" he asked quietly. "It began before I arrived. And they are tracking you." "Probably." Caleb looked back at the stream. Thousands of live viewers now. Entire worlds apparently watching one frightened girl get humiliated for entertainment. The nobleman smiled directly into the camera again. "If the human develops sympathy toward the subject, viewers may place recreational wagers through official channels." Caleb reached over and shut the monitor off so hard the cabin lights flickered. Silence crashed into the room afterward except for the hum of the furnace. Lyra stood perfectly still beside the counter, fingers tightening around the coffee mug. She looked prepared for anger, or disgust, or disappointment. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose and rubbed one tired hand across his face. "Unbelievable." Lyra spoke carefully. "You may return me if this creates problems." Caleb gave a short, bitter laugh at that. "Return you to people who turn suffering into entertainment." He shook his head once. "No chance." She looked genuinely confused by his answer. Caleb pointed toward the dead monitor. "Those people are idiots." The words hung quietly in the warm kitchen air. Simple words. Human words. But something inside Lyra shifted when she heard them. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone had looked at her shame and gotten angry for her instead of at her. 3 nights later, Lyra collapsed beside the furnace. Caleb heard the ceramic mug hit the floor first. He looked up from the oxygen recycler he had been repairing and saw her gripping the edge of the kitchen counter with both hands, pale blue light flickering wildly beneath her skin. Steam rolled off her body in uneven waves. "Hey," Caleb said immediately, dropping his tools. "Lyra." She tried to answer, but her knees gave out before the words came. Caleb caught her just before she hit the floor. Her skin felt burning hot against his arms, far hotter than human fever. The glow beneath her veins pulsed erratically now, almost painful to look at. "I am fine," she whispered weakly. "No, you are definitely not." He carried her to the couch while the storm outside rattled the cabin walls hard enough to make the lights flicker. Snow hammered the roof in heavy bursts, but inside the house the air suddenly felt too warm, too tight. Caleb grabbed the portable medical scanner from his workshop shelf and activated it beside her. Blue light swept slowly across Lyra's body while streams of unreadable alien diagnostics filled the small display screen. Then warning symbols began flashing. Genetic instability detected. Endocrine suppression damage. Cellular reproductive inhibition. Caleb frowned. "What the hell did they do to you?" Lyra closed her eyes. Please turn it off. Not happening. He adjusted the scanner and slowed the pass over her abdomen. The machine emitted a sharp tone. Beneath layers of biological data, Caleb noticed artificial coding woven directly into her nervous system. Not disease. Not natural infertility. Engineering. Someone had altered her body on purpose. He stared at the screen while cold anger slowly settled into his chest. This was done to you, he said quietly. Lyra remained silent for several seconds. Then finally she nodded once. Outside, distant refinery sirens echoed through the storm. Illyrian bloodlines are political assets, she said weakly. My family controlled military cloning patents. Rival houses required leverage. Caleb looked back at the scanner. So they sterilized you. She swallowed carefully before answering. Officially, they called it hereditary instability. Quietly, they called it efficient. The furnace hummed softly beside them. Caleb sat there staring at the glowing diagnostics while Lyra fought to steady her breathing. Human colonies had corruption, greed, corporate cruelty, but there was something especially cold about the way her people weaponized biology itself. Like emotions had been engineered out of them centuries ago. How old were you? Caleb asked. 19. The answer landed heavily in the room. 19. Someone had decided an entire life was disposable before it had even begun. Lyra suddenly shivered violently beneath the blanket. Caleb moved instinctively, kneeling beside the couch while adjusting the thermal settings on the medical scanner. Easy, he muttered. You are overheating. It always becomes worse during cold seasons. Her voice sounded distant now. Exhausted, Caleb disappeared briefly into the workshop before returning with a portable coolant pack and a worn gray cloth soaked in warm water. He placed the cloth gently against the side of her neck. Lyra flinched at first, surprised by the softness of the gesture more than the touch itself. Caleb pretended not to notice. Your nervous system is overloaded, he said quietly while monitoring the scanner. Looks like whatever they implanted is still active. It cannot be removed. Maybe. He glanced down at the glowing lines of alien code again. But I have fixed worse systems with less information. That earned the faintest breath of amusement from her despite the fever. You compare me to machinery often. I repair machinery for a living. And people. Caleb adjusted the blanket around her shoulders carefully before answering. Still learning. Silence settled over the room again. Warm furnace air drifted softly through the cabin while snow buried the windows deeper outside. Lyra's breathing gradually slowed beneath the blanket. Exhaustion finally pulled at her eyes. Just before sleep took her, Caleb felt something unexpected. Her hand, resting lightly against his wrist. Not grabbing, not desperate, just there, quiet, trusting. He looked down at her glowing fingers curled weakly against his skin while the medical scanner continued blinking impossible readings beside them. Then Lyra whispered something so softly he almost missed it. No one stayed before. Caleb sat there for a long moment listening to the storm beyond the walls. Then he pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders and answered in the same quiet voice. Yeah, well, they should have. The storm finally broke 6 days later. Caleb stepped outside just after dawn and stopped cold at the sight of sunlight spilling across the valley for the first time in nearly a week. The frozen refinery towers glittered beneath pale gold light, while long sheets of methane snow drifted slowly from the rooftops in sparkling clouds. The entire colony looked softer after storms ended. Quieter, like the planet itself had finally exhaled. Behind him, the cabin door hissed open. Lyra stepped carefully onto the porch wrapped in Caleb's oversized brown coat, the sleeves hanging far past her glowing hands. She immediately tilted her face toward the sky. Sunlight scattered across her cyan skin in shifting iridescent patterns that looked almost unreal against the snow. Caleb had spent most of his life around machines, reactors, rusted mining rigs, and frozen rock. Nothing on Kepri Outpost was supposed to look beautiful, yet somehow she did. Lyra stared silently across the valley while cold air curled around them in white clouds. It is brighter than I imagined, she said softly. You have never seen snow before? Caleb asked. She shook her head. Illyrian core worlds regulate climate patterns. Weather is considered inefficient. Caleb snorted quietly. Figures. Lyra stepped off the porch slowly, boots crunching into fresh snow. She paused immediately, startled by the sound beneath her feet. Then she crouched down carefully, and touched the surface with one glowing hand. Tiny crystals melted against her fingertips. Frozen water, she murmured with genuine wonder. Humans allow this to happen naturally? Caleb shoved his hands into his jacket pockets against the cold. Most of us do not have planet-sized weather machines. Lyra looked out across the open mining flats again, while distant cargo haulers moved slowly through the morning fog. It feels alive, she whispered. Caleb watched her for a moment before walking toward the old rusted grill beside the cabin. He brushed snow off the top and started preparing the small portable burner underneath a steel coffee pot. You are making coffee outside? Lyra asked, confused. Best way to drink it. The temperature is 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Exactly. She stared at him as though humans were medically concerning. Caleb only grinned faintly and kept working. Soon the smell of brewing coffee drifted into the freezing air, rich and dark against the scent of snow and engine fuel. Lyra slowly moved closer to the burner, drawn by the warmth. The sunlight made the thin, glowing lines beneath her skin look softer now, calmer than before. Healthier. Caleb noticed that too. You are looking better, he said casually. Your fever finally broke. Lyra accepted the warm metal mug he handed her and wrapped both hands around it. Your treatment helped. Mostly rest helped. She looked down into the steaming liquid. No Illyrian physician ever used the word rest. That explains a lot. To Caleb's surprise, she laughed quietly. It was the first real laugh he had heard from her. Small, breathless, but real. The sound lingered strangely in the cold morning air. Lyra took another sip before asking, why do humans care for small rituals so carefully? Caleb leaned back against the porch railing. What do you mean? The coffee, the heat, the blankets, watching snowfall. She glanced toward him curiously. None of these actions improve efficiency. Caleb thought about that for a second while steam curled upward from his cup. Then he shrugged lightly. Maybe not everything is supposed to. Lyra looked at him in silence after that. Not confused this time. Thoughtful. As though she was trying to solve a puzzle no one in her civilization had ever taught her how to see. The wind moved gently through the valley, carrying soft snow across the frozen ground in silver ribbons. Somewhere far below, refinery alarms echoed faintly through the cold. But up on the ridge beside the cabin, the galaxy suddenly felt very far away. And for the first time since arriving on Kepri Outpost, Lyra Vale stood beneath an open sky without looking afraid. The room at the end of the hallway stayed closed most days. Lyra noticed that during her second week inside the cabin. Every morning, Caleb walked past the door without looking at it. Every night, he paused slightly before turning away again. It was the only part of the house he never entered, which meant, eventually, curiosity won. The cabin was quiet that afternoon except for the steady hum of the oxygen recycler and soft music drifting from Caleb's workshop radio. Outside, snow moved gently across the valley beneath pale afternoon light. Lyra walked slowly down the narrow hallway carrying folded laundry she had insisted on helping with despite Caleb repeatedly telling her she did not need to earn her stay. She stopped beside the closed door again. The metal surface looked older than the others. Scratched, worn near the handle from years of use, before suddenly none at all. Her glowing fingers hovered near the control pad. Then she heard Caleb's voice behind her. It sticks sometimes. Lyra turned immediately. Caleb stood at the far end of the hallway holding a toolbox beneath one arm. There was no anger in his face, just tired surprise. I apologize, she said softly. You do not have to. He set the toolbox down slowly. For a second, he looked like he might walk away again. Instead, he stepped forward and pressed his thumb against the old door control. The mechanism hissed quietly before sliding open halfway. Dust drifted through a beam of pale light from the hallway ceiling. The room beyond was small, smaller than Lyra expected, but warmer somehow, softer. A faded yellow blanket rested folded inside a tiny bed against the wall. Old children's books sat untouched on low shelves beside miniature plastic spacecraft models. A hand-painted mural of stars stretched across the far wall beneath years of dust. Everything remained exactly where someone had left it. Waiting. Lyra looked at Caleb carefully. His eyes stayed fixed on the room, distant now. Your child? She asked gently. Caleb nodded once. Would have been. Silence settled heavily between them. The heating vents hummed softly overhead, while the smell of machine oil still lingered faintly on Caleb's work jacket. Lyra stepped slowly into the room. Her glowing skin reflected dimly off tiny silver stars painted on the walls. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Caleb leaned quietly against the doorway. "My wife painted the mural after we found out." He swallowed once before continuing. "Said every kid deserved stars over their head." Lyra glanced toward him. "What happened?" For a long moment Caleb did not answer. Somewhere outside, distant mining sirens echoed across the frozen valley. Finally, he spoke without looking at her. "Oxygen breach during a transport accident." His voice stayed calm. Too calm. "The station sealed damaged sections automatically." Lyra understood immediately what that meant. Human emergency systems prioritized the majority. The door closed. The people inside never came out. Caleb rubbed one hand slowly across the back of his neck. "I was working maintenance 3 decks away when it happened." The room felt impossibly quiet after that. Lyra looked down at the tiny untouched bed beside her. She had spent most of her life among people who treated reproduction like mathematics. Genetic projections, bloodline optimization, controlled inheritance rights. Yet this room felt more sacred than every Illyrian gene chamber she had ever seen combined, because it was built from hope instead of strategy. Caleb finally stepped inside and picked up one small plastic spacecraft from the shelf. Dust coated the faded blue wings. "I kept meaning to pack this room up," he admitted quietly. "Just never did." Lyra watched him carefully beneath the soft yellow light. There was grief inside him still, deep enough to hollow entire years out of a person. But somehow he had remained gentle anyway. That confused her more than anything. "Most Illyrians would isolate themselves after loss," she said softly. Caleb gave a faint shrug. "Humans try to keep going, even when it hurts." He looked around the room one last time before answering. Especially then. Lyra stood there in silence while cold sunlight faded slowly beyond the frosted window. And for the first time in her life, she began to understand something her civilization never taught. Survival was not the same thing as living. Humans knew the difference. The first sign appeared 3 weeks after the storm season ended. Caleb noticed it while repairing a damaged thermal regulator in the workshop. Lyra had been sitting nearby reading one of the old paper books she found in the storage cabinet, quietly sounding out difficult English words under her breath while reactor light flickered softly across the room. Then suddenly she stopped reading. Caleb glanced up immediately. "You okay?" Lyra pressed one glowing hand lightly against the edge of the workbench. Her breathing had changed. Slower. Uneven. "I do not know," she admitted softly. "Something feels strange." Caleb set his tools down. "Bad strange." She hesitated. "Different strange." Before he could ask more, the portable medical scanner on the nearby shelf emitted a sharp automatic tone. Caleb frowned. The machine only activated itself during severe biological fluctuations. He grabbed it quickly and aimed it toward her. Blue light swept across Lyra's body in slow pulses. The scanner paused over her abdomen. Then the warning symbols appeared again. But this time they were different. Caleb stared at the display. Hormonal restoration detected. Cellular regeneration active. Reproductive matrix responding. He blinked once, certain he had misread the translation. Then he scanned her again. Same result. Lyra watched his expression carefully. "What is wrong?" Caleb looked back down at the screen. "That depends." He frowned harder. "Your body is repairing itself." Silence filled the workshop except for the low hum of machinery. Lyra stared at him without moving. "That is impossible," she whispered. "Apparently your biology disagrees." She stood too quickly. The book slipped from her hands onto the floor. "No," her voice trembled now. "No, this cannot happen." Caleb stepped closer carefully. "Lyra." She backed away immediately, pale cyan light flashing wildly beneath her skin again. "Fear. Real fear. They will come for me," she said quietly. "Who?" "Everyone." Caleb lowered the scanner. Slowly. "You are going to need to explain that." Lyra turned away from him, wrapping both arms tightly around herself. Outside the cabin windows, snow drifted softly across the dark valley, while refinery lights blinked in the distance like dying stars. "Illyrian reproductive science is controlled by the High Genetics Council," she said weakly. "Every bloodline, every birth, every inherited trait." Caleb listened silently. "If my suppression damage is reversing," she swallowed hard, "then it means their procedures failed. That sounds more like their problem than yours. You do not understand." She looked back at him now, fear visible even in her glowing silver eyes. Entire political systems were built around genetic certainty, around the belief that biology can be perfected and controlled. Her voice dropped lower. If someone they declared permanently infertile begins recovering naturally, Caleb finally understood. It makes them look wrong. It makes them look powerless. The workshop suddenly felt smaller after that. Caleb glanced down at the scanner again, while streams of impossible data continued scrolling across the display. Human medicine should not have been capable of reversing something this advanced. Yet somehow, slowly, Lyra's body was healing anyway. Not through surgery, not through genetic engineering. Just warmth, rest, safety, time. The realization unsettled him almost as much as it terrified her. Lyra sank slowly into the nearby chair, staring down at her trembling hands. "I spent years believing I was broken," she whispered. "What if I still am?" Caleb walked over quietly and crouched beside her chair until they were eye level. "Listen to me." She looked up slowly. "Nothing about you looks broken to me." The words hit her harder than he intended. He saw it immediately in the way her breathing caught, in the sudden shimmer of emotion crossing her face before she quickly looked away again. Caleb pretended not to notice, giving her space to recover. The medical scanner beeped softly once more between them. Stable regeneration continuing. Estimated progression accelerating. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose and powered the device down. Somewhere beyond the frozen valley, entire civilizations still laughed at the defective alien girl sent away as a joke. They had no idea the impossible was already beginning. The ships arrived at dawn. Caleb saw them first through the kitchen window while pouring coffee into 2 mugs. At first he thought the pale lights above the valley were another refinery convoy breaking through low cloud cover. Then the entire horizon darkened. One by one, massive silver silhouettes descended through the atmosphere in complete silence, their curved hulls reflecting the frozen landscape beneath them like polished mirrors. Not transport vessels. Warships. 50 at least. Maybe more. The coffee pot slipped slightly in Caleb's hand. "Lyra," he said quietly. She stepped into the kitchen wearing one of his gray sweaters, still half asleep. Then she saw the sky. Every trace of color drained from her glowing skin. Outside, colony warning sirens erupted across Kepri Outpost. Red emergency lights flashed between refinery towers while mining crews poured out onto snow-covered platforms, staring upward in confusion. Children pointed at the sky through frosted windows. Freight haulers stopped moving entirely. Nobody on the colony had ever seen an Illyrian fleet this large outside a military broadcast. The lead ship hovered directly above the valley like a second moon. Elegant, silent, terrifying in the way only advanced civilizations could be. Caleb set the mugs down carefully. "Tell me those are not here for you." Lyra could not answer immediately. Her eyes remained locked on the enormous ships above them. "They found the medical fluctuations," she whispered finally. "The regeneration signatures." A cold pressure settled into Caleb's chest. "You mean they tracked your body?" "Illyrian genetic networks monitor all registered bloodlines." Her voice sounded distant now. "Hollow. I was never truly free." Before Caleb could respond, every screen inside the cabin activated simultaneously. Static flickered across the walls before resolving into the image of an Illyrian male seated within a vast silver chamber. Older than the others Caleb had seen before. Sharper, colder, the glowing markings. Beneath his skin resembled cracks in frozen ice. "Lyra Vale," the figure announced calmly. "By order of the High Genetics Council, you are instructed to surrender yourself for immediate containment and medical reclamation." Caleb stepped in front of Lyra without thinking. Containment. The alien's silver eyes shifted toward him for the first time. Human Caleb Mercer. His pronunciation of the name sounded almost clinical. "Your cooperation will be compensated generously." Caleb folded his arms. "That usually means I should say no." The Illyrian ignored the comment entirely. The subject's biological condition now represents a destabilizing threat to multiple interstellar treaties. Lyra looked physically ill hearing the words subject and condition again. "You declared me defective," she said quietly toward the screen. "You abandoned me." "Correction," the alien replied evenly. "You were reassigned after genetic failure." Caleb felt anger rise hot in his chest. Funny way to describe throwing someone away. The Illyrian finally regarded him with visible irritation. Human emotional attachment is irrelevant to this matter. Seems pretty relevant to me. Outside, another massive warship descended lower over the colony, casting moving shadows across the snow-covered valley. Colony loudspeakers crackled alive moments later, ordering all civilians indoors until further notice. Fear spread quickly on places this isolated. Caleb knew that. Lyra wrapped her arms tightly around herself beside the kitchen counter. "They will not stop," she whispered. "Not now." The elder Illyrian spoke again, his voice colder this time. Medical scans confirm spontaneous reproductive restoration within subject veil. Silence filled the cabin. Even the furnace seemed quieter. Such biological recovery contradicts established Illyrian genomic law. Therefore, the subject must be secured for study before misinformation spreads. Caleb stared at the screen in disbelief. "You came across half the galaxy because your science got embarrassed?" "We came," the alien corrected calmly, "because civilizations collapse when certainty dies." Then the transmission ended. The screens went black. Simultaneously, outside, 50 silver warships remained hanging motionless over the frozen valley like patient predators. Lyra lowered herself slowly into the nearby chair, trembling now despite the heat inside the cabin. Caleb looked toward the sky through the frost-covered window, then back at her. "They are not taking you," he said firmly. Lyra looked up immediately. "Caleb." No, his voice stayed calm. "Steady. You are not some experiment they can lock back in a box because reality stopped obeying them." Outside, the warships continued descending lower through the clouds while snow drifted silently across Kepri Outpost beneath the growing shadow of an empire. The colony stopped sleeping after the fleet arrived. Floodlights burned through every hour of darkness now, casting long pale beams across the frozen refinery fields while armed security patrols moved between buildings in nervous silence. Nobody trusted quiet skies filled with warships. Caleb noticed people staring at his cabin whenever he drove supply routes through the outpost. Word had spread quickly. Human mechanic hiding an alien female. Human mechanic being watched by an empire. Human mechanic about to get everyone killed. He ignored most of it, but the tension settled into the valley like another winter storm. That night the temperature dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind scraped hard against the cabin walls while the furnace struggled to keep pace with the cold. Caleb sat at the kitchen table repairing a broken circuit board beneath a hanging work lamp when he noticed Lyra standing alone beside the window again. She had been doing that more lately, watching the fleet, watching the sky like someone waiting for gravity itself to fail. The silver glow from orbit reflected faintly across her skin. "You should sleep," Caleb said without looking up. "Your body is still recovering." Lyra kept staring out the window. Illyrian ships do not wait this long unless they are preparing pressure tactics. Caleb adjusted the wiring carefully. That a military term? No, her voice sounded distant. Political. Silence settled briefly between them. The old cabin creaked softly beneath another blast of cold wind. Finally, Lyra spoke again. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb glanced up from the circuit board. "Doing what?" "Protecting me." Her silver eyes reflected faintly in the glass. "You owe me nothing." Caleb leaned back slowly in his chair. "You keep saying that like kindness is supposed to be a transaction. For most civilizations, it is." He studied her quietly for a moment. There was genuine confusion in her voice. Not manipulation. Not self-pity. She truly could not understand why someone would risk themselves without expecting something in return. That realization hurt more than he expected. Caleb set the circuit board aside. "Come here," he said softly. Lyra hesitated before walking toward the kitchen table. Caleb reached beneath it and pulled out an old metal storage box scratched from years of use. He opened it carefully. Inside sat photographs. Paper ones. Real ones. Lyra watched him lift a faded picture from the stack with careful hands. A woman smiled back from the image beside a younger Caleb beneath bright earth sunlight. Her dark hair moved wildly in ocean wind while one hand rested against a small, barely visible pregnancy curve beneath her jacket. Her name was Nora, Caleb said quietly. Lyra sat across from him without speaking. She used to say humans are weird because we keep loving things even after we know they can hurt us. A faint smile crossed his face for just a second, then faded. I told her that sounded inefficient. Lyra looked down at the photograph again. You loved her very much. Still do. The furnace clicked softly somewhere deeper in the cabin. Caleb stared at the old picture while snow moved across the windows behind them. After the accident, he continued quietly. People kept telling me to move on. Start over. Like grief was a machine problem you fix by replacing damaged parts. He shook his head once. But that is not how people work. Lyra listened carefully now, every word settling somewhere deeper inside her than she expected. So when I saw them throw you away like broken equipment, Caleb looked up at her finally. I knew exactly what that felt like. The room went very still after that. Lyra lowered her eyes toward her glowing hands resting in her lap. In Illyrian society, she whispered, value comes from usefulness. Genetic perfection. Status. Continuation. Her voice weakened slightly. Nobody has ever protected me simply because I mattered to them. Caleb answered without hesitation. Then your people forgot something important. She looked at him slowly. What? Caleb leaned back in the chair, exhaustion visible beneath his calm expression. That being alive should already be enough. Lyra stared at him across the warm kitchen light, while distant warships hovered silently over the frozen valley beyond the walls. For the first time in her carefully engineered life, she began understanding why humans terrified the galaxy so much. Not because they were stronger, but because they kept choosing compassion even when logic told them not to. The tribunal chamber floated above Kepri Outpost like a piece of another universe forced into orbit around a mining colony that never asked for it. Caleb stared through the shuttle window as the silver structure rotated slowly against the blackness of space, its surface glowing with cold white lines that pulsed like a living nervous system. Beside him, Lyra sat perfectly still. Too still. Her hands rested tightly together in her lap, while distant stars reflected across her pale cyan skin. She had barely spoken during the ascent from the colony's surface. Caleb understood why. This was not a meeting. It was judgment. The shuttle docked silently inside the Illyrian station moments later. The doors opened onto a corridor of polished white metal, so clean it barely looked real. No sound except their footsteps. No visible guards either, though Caleb knew perfectly well they were being watched from every direction. The air smelled sterile, sharp with recycled oxygen and faint metallic ozone. Lyra slowed slightly beside him as they approached the massive chamber doors ahead. Caleb noticed immediately. You all right? He asked quietly. She nodded once, but her glow dimmed beneath her skin. Fear. The doors parted. Caleb had expected politicians. Scientists maybe. Instead, he found an amphitheater. Hundreds of Illyrians set elevated in silver. Tiers surrounding the central floor beneath a towering domed ceiling filled with artificial stars. Every eye in the chamber turned toward them at once. The silence felt surgical. Caleb suddenly understood what prey animals must feel like. At the center platform stood the elder counselor from the transmission. His silver robes flowed behind him like liquid metal, while glowing markings pulsed calmly beneath his pale skin. Lyra Vale, he announced. Former archivist of House Vale. His voice echoed across the chamber effortlessly. You stand accused of unauthorized biological destabilization and dissemination of false genomic precedent. Caleb frowned immediately. That sounds made up. A ripple moved through the audience. Some looked disturbed by the interruption. Others looked fascinated. The elder counselor regarded Caleb with visible irritation. Human emotional disruption will not alter this proceeding. Caleb folded his arms. Still sounds made up. Lyra gently touched his sleeve before he could continue. Please, she whispered softly. Do not provoke them. The elder counselor turned his attention back toward her. Recent scans confirm spontaneous restoration of suppressed reproductive systems. Murmurs spread through the chamber immediately. Some Illyrians looked genuinely alarmed now. Others stared at Lyra almost hungrily, like scientists discovering a dangerous miracle. Such recovery contradicts 3 centuries of established genomic law. The counselor continued. Therefore, one conclusion remains. He looked directly at her. Human contamination has altered your biological integrity. Caleb felt anger rise instantly. Contamination? Several Illyrians flinched slightly at the sharpness in his voice. The elder counselor remained calm. Human emotional bonding patterns are chemically unstable and evolutionarily irrational. Cross-species exposure introduces unpredictable endocrine variables. Caleb gave a short, disbelieving laugh. So your official argument is kindness broke your science? The chamber went completely silent after that. Even Lyra looked stunned beside him. The counselor's glowing eyes narrowed slightly. Human Caleb Mercer. You misunderstand the severity of this matter. No, Caleb replied quietly. I think you do. He stepped slightly forward despite the hundreds of alien eyes watching him. You built your entire civilization around controlling life so tightly that the second someone heals naturally, you call it corruption. The chamber stirred uneasily again. Lyra looked at him with widening eyes. Caleb barely noticed. You labeled her defective because she could not fit inside your system anymore, he continued. Then the moment she starts recovering, suddenly she matters again. The elder counselor's voice sharpened for the first time. She matters because her condition threatens societal stability. Caleb looked directly at him. No, she matters because she is alive. Silence crashed across the chamber. Real silence this time. Heavy enough to feel. Lyra stared at him beside the glowing tribunal floor while artificial stars shimmered overhead. No one had ever spoken inside this chamber that way before. Not to the council. Not about someone like her. The elder counselor finally broke the silence. Humanity's greatest weakness, he said coldly, is emotional attachment. Caleb looked toward Lyra for just a second before answering. Funny, his voice stayed calm. Steady. From where I am standing, it looks more like yours. They kept Caleb and Lyra inside the tribunal station for 2 more days. Not prisoners officially. Guests, according to the council. But every corridor they walked already had guards waiting at the next intersection. Every door opened only after silent approval codes. Every room hummed faintly with surveillance systems hidden beneath polished silver walls. Civilized captivity still felt like captivity. Caleb stood near the observation window of their assigned chamber, watching Kepri Outpost rotate slowly below the station. The frozen mining colony looked tiny from orbit. Fragile. One accident away from disappearing forever into the dark. Behind him, Lyra sat quietly at the edge of the sleeping platform, staring down at her glowing hands again. She had barely touched her food since the tribunal. Caleb noticed. You should eat something. I am not hungry. That is not how biology works. A faint shimmer crossed her expression, almost amused despite everything. But it faded quickly. They will not stop, Caleb. Her voice stayed soft. Tired. Now that the council has confirmed restoration activity, I am no longer an embarrassment. She looked up at him slowly. I am valuable again. Caleb hated the way she said the word valuable. Like it had nothing to do with being loved. Only owned. Before he could answer, the chamber doors opened automatically. 2 Illyrian officials entered in flowing silver robes. Between them walked the elder counselor from the tribunal. His expression remained calm as frozen glass. Human Caleb Mercer, he said evenly. A private discussion has been authorized. Caleb folded his arms immediately. That usually means somebody wants something. The counselor ignored the remark and approached the observation window instead. The stars reflected faintly across his pale skin. You are aware your species possesses no legal authority within Illyrian jurisdiction, and yet you still keep inviting me to meetings. The elder counselor finally looked toward him. Because despite your emotional volatility, you remain central to this situation. Lyra stood slowly from the sleeping platform, tension visible beneath her glowing skin. What do you want? The counselor regarded her calmly. A resolution. He activated a holographic display between them. Numbers appeared first. Resource transfers. Property rights. Colonial citizenship authorizations. More money than Caleb had seen in his entire life. Return with us voluntarily, the counselor said to Lyra. And Human Mercer will receive full compensation for his cooperation. Caleb stared at the hologram in disbelief. You are trying to buy her? We are attempting diplomacy. That is not diplomacy. Caleb looked directly at him now. That is trafficking with better lighting. One of the officials beside the counselor stiffened slightly at the comment. The elder himself remained perfectly composed. You misunderstand the generosity being offered. Human colonies operate under severe economic strain. Your future would become secure. Caleb glanced once at the enormous figures glowing across the display. Enough money to leave Kepri forever. Enough to never repair another oxygen filter or crawl through another frozen maintenance tunnel again. Enough to erase years of exhaustion. Then he looked toward Lyra. She stood completely still beside the sleeping platform, fear buried carefully behind her expression. But Caleb saw it anyway. Not fear for herself. Fear that he might finally realize she was too dangerous to keep protecting. The realization settled heavily inside his chest. "No," he said quietly. The counselor blinked once. "Clarify." I said no. Caleb stepped forward and deactivated the hologram with one sharp motion. Nobody gets sold. For the first time since meeting him, the elder counselor's calm expression cracked slightly. Human attachment patterns continue impairing your judgment. Caleb shook his head slowly. "No, they are the only reason my judgment still works." Silence filled the chamber. Lyra stared at him as though she had stopped breathing entirely. The counselor studied Caleb carefully now, almost like he was seeing humanity clearly for the first time and finding it deeply inconvenient. "You would sacrifice security, status, and planetary citizenship," he said coldly, "for one unstable alien female?" Caleb answered immediately. "I would sacrifice all of it before letting somebody be treated like property again." The words hung heavily in the sterile air. Lyra lowered her eyes suddenly, emotion flickering visibly beneath her glowing skin. No one in her entire life had ever chosen her over power before. The elder counselor finally turned away from them both. "Then you leave us no efficient solution." Caleb watched him walk toward the chamber doors. "Good," he said quietly. The counselor paused briefly without looking back. "Human Caleb Mercer." His voice had lost some of its certainty now. "You are willing to endanger yourself for beings who may never repay your loyalty." Caleb glanced toward Lyra one last time before answering. "That is called love where I come from." Then the chamber doors closed, leaving only silence, stars, and the sound of Lyra trying very hard not to cry. 1 year later, the valley. Lights of Kepri outpost still flickered gold against the snow every night. The refinery towers still groaned beneath freezing winds. Cargo haulers still crawled slowly across the mining flats through clouds of methane ice. Some things never changed on the edge of space. But Caleb noticed people looked up at the sky more often now, especially after sunset. Especially when silver ships appeared overhead. The first alarm sounded just before dawn. Caleb was outside repairing an iced overpressure line when the colony sirens echoed across the valley again. Workers immediately stopped moving. Mining cranes froze mid-operation. Above them, dozens of silver lights pierced through the cloud cover one by one. Another fleet, larger this time. Caleb wiped frost from his gloves and looked toward the sky without panic. He already knew who it was. The lead vessel descended slowly through pale morning fog before settling over the landing platform beside his cabin. Snow spiraled outward beneath the enormous engines while silent crowds gathered along nearby refinery catwalks to watch. Nobody on Kepri had forgotten the last Illyrian arrival. Caleb removed his work goggles as the ship's ramp lowered. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a familiar figure stepped through the silver mist. Lyra. The entire platform seemed to stop breathing at once. She looked different now, stronger somehow. Her glowing cyan skin shimmered brighter beneath the dawn light, healthy and alive in ways Caleb had never seen before. Long silver-blue fabric moved softly around her as she descended the ramp, one hand resting carefully against the railing. But Caleb barely noticed any of that, because she was not alone. A small sound drifted softly through the cold air. Then another, tiny. Curious. Caleb's heart nearly stopped. Lyra reached the bottom of the ramp slowly while holding 2 small, bundled children against her chest. Twin infants. One wrapped in pale silver cloth, the other in dark blue. Their tiny glowing hands curled sleepily against her shoulders while soft cyan light pulsed beneath translucent skin. Half human, half Illyrian. Entirely real. Nobody spoke. Not the refinery workers. Not the colony guards. Not even the Illyrian officials descending silently behind her. The galaxy itself felt quiet. Caleb stared at the children in complete disbelief. Lyra, her silver eyes met his across the frozen platform. Tears shimmered there openly now. Not shame, not fear, joy. "They are healthy," she whispered softly. "Completely healthy." Caleb stepped closer slowly like he was afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too fast. The infants looked impossibly small against the endless machinery and snow surrounding them. One opened bright silver eyes briefly before gripping his finger with a tiny glowing hand. Caleb exhaled sharply, emotion catching somewhere deep in his chest. "Twins?" he asked quietly, still stunned. A small laugh escaped Lyra through tears. Apparently, humans do not believe in moderation. Around them, the Illyrian officials remained motionless. Their expressions had changed completely now. No superiority, no amusement, only stunned silence. Because the children represented something their civilization believed impossible. Stable hybrid genetics, perfect neural synchronization, no degradation markers, no inherited suppression flaws. The Council's greatest scientific certainty had collapsed inside two sleeping infants wrapped in blankets. One of the elder officials finally stepped forward slowly. Caleb recognized him immediately from the tribunal chamber. But this time the counselor's voice carried no coldness at all, only disbelief. The children's genomic stability exceeds pure Illyrian baselines. Murmurs spread quietly through the gathered officials. That cannot happen, one whispered faintly. Caleb looked down at the twins again, while cold morning light spilled across the snow around them. Looks like it already did. Lyra stepped closer until she stood directly beside him beneath the drifting snowfall. The smaller infant yawned softly against her shoulder, while the other continued gripping Caleb's finger with surprising strength. They wanted to study them, Lyra admitted quietly. To measure them, classify them. Caleb glanced toward her carefully, and she looked down at the children with a gentle expression he had never seen before. Peace. I told them they were not experiments. Snow moved silently across the landing platform, while silver warships hovered motionless above the valley. But for the first time since the fleet first arrived, nobody looked afraid anymore. Because standing there beneath the frozen sky was proof that humanity had done something the galaxy's greatest civilization never could. It healed what cruelty tried to erase. The nursery light glowed soft amber against the cabin walls while snow drifted silently outside the windows. Caleb sat in the old wooden chair beside the crib with one of the twins asleep against his shoulder, tiny glowing fingers curled loosely around the fabric of his shirt. The child's heartbeat pulsed softly against his chest. Warm, steady, real. Outside, Kepri Outpost remained buried beneath another winter storm, refinery lights flickering through sheets of methane snow far below the ridge. But inside the cabin, everything felt still. Peaceful in a way Caleb had forgotten life could become. The second crib near the window rocked gently beside Lyra, who hummed quietly beneath her breath, while the other infant drifted toward sleep, wrapped inside a thick gray blanket. Her glowing skin reflected softly through the darkened room now, no longer flickering with fear or pain. Just warmth. Caleb watched her for a long moment across the nursery light. 1 year ago, she had arrived in a shipping crate wearing a collar and the word defective stamped across her life. Now she stood beside a crib in his home with snowlight shining across her face, while two children slept safely nearby. Sometimes the universe changed so slowly you barely noticed it happening. And sometimes it changed all at once. Lyra finally looked up and caught him staring. What? She asked softly. Caleb smiled faintly. Nothing. She narrowed her silver eyes slightly. That is a human lie. A quiet laugh escaped him before he could stop it. The sleeping infant against his shoulder stirred softly at the sound. Caleb immediately lowered his voice again. Sorry. Lyra stepped closer beside the chair, her expression gentler now. You were thinking too loudly. Is that an Illyrian skill? No, she looked down at the child sleeping against his chest. It is a parent skill. The words settled quietly into the room between them. Parent, not guardian, not genetic carrier, not subject designation. Something warmer. Human. Caleb looked toward the old mural of painted stars still stretched across the nursery wall. Norris stars. He had almost painted over them once after the accident, because seeing them hurt too much. Now soft cyan light from the twins reflected gently across every faded constellation. Somehow the room no longer felt haunted, just full again. Outside the nursery, faint sounds drifted through the cabin from the kitchen radio. Colony updates. Trade negotiations. More Illyrian delegations arriving every month now. Not with warships anymore. With diplomats. Scientists. Families. Entire worlds trying to understand what humanity had done differently. The official reports called the twins a genomic anomaly. A breakthrough in hybrid stabilization theory. Proof of adaptive emotional biological synchronization. Caleb thought all of that sounded ridiculous. The babies were sleeping because Lyra sang to them when storms frightened them. They laughed when snow touched their glowing hands for the first time. They reached for warmth, for voices, for love, same as every child ever born. The galaxy had spent centuries trying to engineer perfection while humans were busy learning smaller things. How to stay after loss. How to protect people with no advantage to yourself. How to keep loving even when grief made it painful. Lyra gently rested one hand against Caleb's shoulder while looking down at the sleeping twins. The council requested another audience today, she said quietly. Caleb sighed softly. Let me guess. More questions. Many. A small smile touched her lips. They still do not understand why my restoration accelerated near humans. Caleb glanced toward her. Did you tell them? No, why not? Lyra looked toward the frost-covered window where snow moved silently beneath distant refinery lights, then back toward the children sleeping safely inside the warm nursery. Because they keep searching for a scientific answer, she whispered softly. Caleb leaned back in the chair while the infant slept peacefully against his chest, and Lyra's glowing hand tightened gently around his shoulder. Some things are not healed by science. Silence settled around them after that. Warm furnace air drifted softly through the nursery while snow covered the valley outside inch by inch. Caleb looked down at the child sleeping in his arms. Tiny heartbeat, tiny breath, tiny glowing fingers wrapped trustingly against him. Then he closed his eyes briefly and listened to the sound every lonely corner of the universe eventually searches for. Home.